Speaking of inadequate solutions, Sajid Javid, the former Home Secretary, has launched a new independent commission on community and cohesion to apparently explore the underlying divisions and tensions that led to the riots following the Southport massacre last summer. But when you investigate the organisations and members of said board, you'll realise it's just another cover-up in waiting. It's in no way independent. It is another front for state-funded actors to launder their preconceived conclusions through. And all it's going to say is we need more efforts to combat Islamophobia, more top-down directed assimilation efforts to enforce British values on the host population and imported tribal minorities alike, more liquidation of British identity to encompass its antonyms, and more online censorship. So the members of this committee, its funding sources are pretty opaque, but its secretariat organisation is the Together Initiative. Now, this was co-founded by Brendan Cox. He is the husband of the late MP Joe Cox, who was murdered in 2016 by some schizo who shouted, "This is for Brexit." And Joe Cox's sister, Brendan's sister-in-law, is Kim Leadbeater, the MP who put forward the assisted dying bill as a private member's bill sponsored by the assisted dying lobby recently, and she has sort of cloaked herself in her sister's tragic murder so that you can't criticise her, otherwise you're a member of the far right and you're putting her life at risk. So incredibly cynical and incredibly exploitative. The other stakeholders in the ICCC include British Future, which is founded and run by Sundar Katwala, the former General Secretary of the Fabian Society, the socialist group whose emblem is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and also Belong, which call themselves the Cohesion and Integration Network. Now, they contributed to the 2024 Dame Sarah Khan review of social cohesion. And this particular review by Dame Sarah Khan, a name that will come up later, completely omitted the likes of Islamist groups and Black Lives Matter and its various militant anti-white racists as deleterious forces on social cohesion. Instead, it just seemed to blame the far right, as per usual. Now, Katwala, he said, the reason he said he's joining is because the Southport riots were a shocking scene of racist disorder we haven't seen in his lifetime. So before they've even engaged in the enterprise of evidence gathering, they have defined a priori those who protested and engaged in violent disorder after the murder of those three girls by second-generation Rwandan Axel Rudakabana in Southport. They have defined them as ontologically evil, and therefore their concerns are all illegitimate. So you know this committee is pervaded by ideology and will not want to revisit the false premises of the immigration and multicultural settlement that led to the state of affairs in the first place, even though a majority of people, when polled by, I think it was Savanta, said that immigration policy was to blame for the Southport riots. And about 46% of people said immigrants themselves and illegal migrants and asylum seekers are to blame for bringing social tensions to this febrile point, which was ignited by this mass atrocity in Southport. Those three organisations, that's Belong, British Future, and Together, they published a report called After the Riots. So this was fresh from Southport, and they recommended a centrally planned national cohesion strategy to build young people's resilience to online misinformation and extremist narratives, for schools and the police to enact a mandate under the Equality Act 2010 to promote cohesion, foster good relations with communities, which basically means giving more money and privileged status to protected characteristics groups, immigrants, non-white minorities, Muslims, and those with unorthodox sexual preferences. And they also said that they called upon the government to reconvene a anti-Muslim hatred working group. So we know, this is the genesis point, why Angela Rayner is now bringing together a group of people like Carrier Sim and Dominic Grieve to redefine Islamophobia and essentially enforce a blasphemy law via state guidance from the top down. And this is after Angela Rayner and the Labour Party in 2019 signed up to the all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia's definition of Islamophobia, all-party parliamentary group of British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which said that Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism that targets Muslimness and perceived Muslimness, a proper, like Matt Walsh, what is a woman definition of Islamophobia. Islamophobia being a phrase invented by the Muslim Brotherhood, according to Dr. Giles Keppel and an ex-jihadist who was in the meeting, where they said, we need to cloak ourselves in a term that renders us impervious from criticism while we sponsor terror around the globe, that is just as effective as homophobia or anti-Semitism was, which is why you often hear them in the same sentences by demented leftist activists who think that Islam is just one of many religions in a global buffet that you can compartmentalize in your private life, and it's just a source for unsubstantiated bigotry by evil straight white male racists. All of this stuff that's going on ever since Southport, the anxiety to control further online speech, the desire to record more non-crime hate incidents, the desire to establish an Islamophobia definition, a lot of this comes from these figures right here. That's Katwala, that's Belong, and British Future, and that's the Together Declaration, and they are the co-sponsoring organisations behind this new ICCC headed by Sajid Javid. Bear in mind, British Future has received over £750,650 in government grants and contracts. Belong have received over £44,000 since 2023. They use that to sponsor Muslim stargazing groups in Rochdale. Yeah, exactly where the grooming gangs have been happening, as well as Gaza and Israel roundtables, and report with councils in Bradford, Manchester, Calderdale, Kirklees and Walsall, all districts which have been blighted by the Pakistani grooming gangs, on community cohesion, and they're particularly concerned about racism and Islamophobia. So these are all organisations which have contributed to the stultifying climate of censorship, which has put top-down pressure on politicians, the media, local councillors and the British public who have tried to raise concern about the grooming gangs and have felt unable to, and therefore led to riots in largely Labour-controlled areas after the Southport massacre, particularly in Rotherham, where more people have been arrested for participating in the protests and riots than for participating in the grooming gangs. Other members of this committee should ring alarm bells. Dame Sarah Khan, the former government advisor for counter-extremism and the independent advisor for social cohesion and resilience, whose sister ran RICU, the Research, Information and Communications Unit that I've discussed before on this channel, in the Home Office, which is basically their propaganda department, their don't look back in anger department, which anytime someone reads the Quran a bit too seriously and detonates a nail bomb at a pop concert, or drives a car past the diversity bollards and goes around stabbing people on London or Westminster Bridge, they bus imams out to the site for photo ops, they control the front pages of newspapers, they run prefabricated hashtag campaigns, and they stage events to tell the grieving families, don't look back in anger, or don't hold any hate in your heart for any race or religion. And the perfect example of this was in 2014, when British aid worker Alan Henning was beheaded on video by ISIS. An image appeared on the front page of The Sun of a woman in the Union Jack hijab. This was invented as part of the hashtag Making a Stand campaign by the charity Inspire, in collaboration with Breakthrough Media, who have ties with the Home Office. Inspire was the charity invented by Dame Sarah Khan after she was already working at the Home Office since 2005 on the Community Cohesion Commission after the 7/7 bombings. So Dame Sarah Khan, I mean, she's been accused of being a creature of the Home Office by like Baroness Wolsey before, also someone who has questionable ties to Muslim organisations like MEND, who she herself has said, although they're not illegal, they're illiberal. Dame Sarah Khan has batted off that accusation of being a Home Office stooge, but she's worked for them for about 20 years, and on her watch, Prevent deprioritised monitoring Islamic extremism, even though the number of Islamic terror attacks has increased, and Islamists remain the largest group for MI5 and counter-terror police's watch list. They remain upwards of 60% of terror suspects and convicted terrorists in custody. Despite that, now the far right have more referrals than Islamists, and then the sort of disaggregated, generalized category of mental health and mixed instabilities has become the largest overall referral category, and it's because William Shawcross said that a number of Home Office employees are recalcitrant to admit that there's any connection between Islamic doctrine and Islamic terrorism. In fact, on the website where Prevent defines its terms, where before they've defined cultural nationalism, the belief that mass migration is putting British culture and way of life at threat, where they defined that as a terrorist ideology, which was then condemned by the US State Department. In the same glossary of terms where they say cultural nationalism is a right-wing extremist terror ideology, they emphasize that Islamist terrorism is not to be taken as a representative of Islam. And that's because there is a very large Islamic network, over 700 members, that work within the Home Office. This grew under Khan's watch. Members of this Home Office Islamic network have sat in seminars with King's College London and declared Prevent to be racist because it focuses on Islamist extremism, shortly before pointing and laughing at an ISIS recruitment video and saying, "Hey, I know that terrorist. He used to go to my school. I know him." Other members have recently blocked persecuted Christians fleeing forced conversion from gaining asylum in the country because they have fabricated government documents to say that this country is safe. Recently, there was one member who was convicted for taking bribes to overturn denied asylum applications from Muslims. I think it's from Bangladesh. So he's going to prison. The broader civil service Muslim network have been caught. They were suspended in March 2024 for anti-Semitism and anti-Israel stuff and were reinstated when the Labour government came in September. But members have been caught in seminars saying that the fight between Israel and Gaza is a fight between good and evil. They refer to Israel as Satan. Now again, I'm not Jewish, I've never been to Israel, but I don't think they have great opinions of the native white British host majority over whom they govern, and there are clear conflicts of interest here. All of this grew up under Dame Sarah Khan's watch. Dame Sarah Khan also last December decided to partner with communist organisation Hope Not Hate to produce a paper alleging that Britain faces a chronic risk of democratic decline due to the spread of extremist narratives and conspiracies. They included, by the way, that contemporary far-right narratives on asylum seekers allude to them as Muslim invaders, with small boat crossings being characterized as an invasion of fighting aged men. Apparently that's a conspiracy theory, as is the phrase cultural Marxism, as is Renaud Camus' phrase, which I can't say on YouTube, the large swap, synonym for that, as is also the World Economic Forum's promise of the Great Reset, which, as we know, thanks to FOIs from my friend Lewis Brackpool, the UK government in 2020 were actively collaborating with the World Economic Forum to enact their proposed policies. And, when Klaus Schwab just writes a book titled The Great Reset and then keeps saying we need a Great Reset, turns out the Great Reset is a real thing. But no, they were just gaslighting the entire population using a communist group, which Sarah Khan funded to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds in taxpayers' cash, while she and her sister ran the Home Office. These are the types of people that are running this committee with Sajid Javid. Now, Sajid Javid expressed total apathy in 2021 when news broke that Britain, its largest cities, are becoming minority white English. When Nigel Farage pointed this out, Sajid Javid tweeted out, "So what?" And he's joined in his apathy, by the way, by another member of this committee, our old friend Fraser Nelson, who responded to Matt Goodwin's recent research that said by 2063 the white British will become a minority in their own country by calling it unpalatable nativism. So he's just accusing him of racism, and he was saying, reform will basically become undone and Nigel Farage won't become Prime Minister if you don't keep Zia Yusuf in the party, positioning Zia Yusuf as the heir apparent, because for some strange reason the likes of Fraser Nelson or, let's say, Michael Gove are obsessed with putting their liberal platitudes in the mouth of second-generation or even first-generation immigrants, in the case of Kemi Badenoch, because they believe that only these people can make the case for integration for these febrile tribal minorities who have either apathy, in the case of Sajid Javid, or contempt, in the case of Bob Villan, for the native British host majority, as long as they remain a majority. Also, it should be noted as well that Sajid Javid's brother, I think it's Baz, also works at the Home Office overseeing immigration. So we've got a sort of family network of second-generation Pakistanis running the British government, and we wonder why levels of Muslim migration remain high. We wonder why the government sets about gaslighting the population about the true nature of Islam anytime a jihadist detonates a nail bomb at a children's pop concert. We wonder why the Home Office has to insist that Islamism has absolutely nothing to do with Islam, but if you read Douglas Murray, watch Great Western Railway Journeys, or enjoy George Orwell's 1984, you're an actively patriotic and proud far-right extremist who should be put on a watch list, which I remind you did actually happen. Other members, they include Javid's co-chair, the former Labour Community Secretary, John Cruddas. They include Caroline Lucas, the former co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, who insisted that there is no such thing as an illegal migrant, everyone's an asylum seeker, and all of those should be given blanket citizenship. And they include Sir Andy Street, the former mayor of the West Midlands, who said Birmingham has no no-go zones, even though it was reported literally a year before he said it because of the number of murders that happened in Birmingham. And he said, a lurch to the right on immigration specifically would be really the wrong direction to our current situation after the Conservative Party lost the last election and after he himself lost his seat. This is despite obviously 90% of constituencies in England and Wales wanting immigration reduced when they underestimate the level of net migration by a factor of 10. They think it's 70,000 rather than 700,000. Street just happened to give an interview in May to the New Statesman about where conservatism should lead. And even though immigration is the most prescient issue for everyone in the country, wasn't mentioned once. Also, there's Lord Woolley of Woodford, and he's the founder and director of Operation Black Vote. So literally racially sectarian politics, and we're going to this guy for how we should improve community cohesion. And he was also the chair of the Race Disparity Units Advisory Group. So he is a believer in disparity equals discrimination, which is premised on the false anthropology of the blank slate, which says that literally everyone from anywhere is exactly identical, that all geographic and cultural differences and discrepancies in education and wealth, all inequalities can be ameliorated and eradicated by state intervention, and that literally anyone who passes through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick and is marinated in the osmotic atoms of British values that just float in the air, that they become indistinguishably as British as you and me. This guy believes that, while also insisting that local councils are not diverse enough. In 2019, he said there was a shocking lack of diversity among local councils and said, when you have local authorities that are more diverse, more gender, more disabilities and more minorities, everyone wins because the nature of debate is more inclusive and dynamic. Certainly not the case in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham, Bradford, Manchester, any of these places where local councils have made it their mission to, and I quote from the Alexis J report into Rotherham, they've made their number one priority to preserve and enhance the Pakistani heritage community and prioritise that over the safety of white British girls who they allowed to become victims of the Pakistani grooming gangs because they didn't want their reputations to be impugned with accusations of racism. What we're seeing here is an obsession by the ICCC with the second-order concerns, as Douglas Murray would say, of the deleterious impacts of mass immigration and multiculturalism. They will never revisit the mass immigration settlement. Instead, they will only seek to top-down manage, in the manner of Singapore, which Sajid Javid mentioned in his Times piece, the consequences of unwanted, rapid, and unassimilable demographic and cultural change. They are obsessed with, and they list these in their pieces justifying the establishment of the committee, economic hardship, institutional mistrust, and the siloization and misinformation generated by social media. All of those weeds that have sprung up in the infrastructure of the British state had to be first fostered in the fertile soil of irreconcilable religious differences and ethnic tensions, which would not exist if they were not imported in the first place and encouraged by divisive identity politics, a multicultural appeasement strategy, and the lie being told from the highest officers of state, including by Rishi Sunak, who minted the Diversity Built Britain coin, and Michael Gove, who said at the Dispatch box, we're a multi-faith, multinational, multi-ethnic society, and that's the source of our strength. If they had not spread this lie that Britain was a nation of immigrants, we would not have got ourselves in this febrile environment where civil strife is building between the native British and the immigrant populations in the first place. So this is not only a complete waste of money, that's backed, by the way, by, as its various parent organisations are, the NHS, local councils, the National Lottery, Marks and Spencer's, Sainsbury's, PwC, various businesses, charities, and state organisations. So it's clearly just like a shop front for what the state wants the official narrative on Southport to be, as was the Home Affairs Select Committee report, which said there's no such thing as two-tier policing, even though the Constable of West Merseyside Police said she had considered leaking the Rudakabana family's Christian background not to tell the public the truth about its identity, but in her own words, to protect Muslim communities. So even though they admit they're engaging in two-tier policing, they tell us there's no two-tier policing, the purpose of the ICCC, the committee, is not only to launder the state's preferred narrative through the pretense of neutrality and impartiality, but it is also a wholly insufficient response to the cataclysm that awaits us if we remain on rails on the course towards this hypothetical settlement, towards a multicultural utopia. Immigration isn't working. Integration isn't happening, as Fraser Nelson said. It's not a miracle. The Boris wave is not an accident, as Nelson said again. 1 million Indians weren't blown to our shores by a weather event over the course of 4 years. If we still get the likes of, as he had a pop at me on Twitter last week, Michael Gove insisting that the Michaela School is basically a model for how the British state should be run, that there is no such thing as a distinct English ethnic identity, as both Nelson and Gove have said. If you can reduce being British down to a set of universal platitudes like a fondness for the rule of law, fairness and tolerance, as if we're playing one big cricket game, if we continue to indulge in this dangerous delusion and don't revisit the root causes of this unwanted and avoidable racial and religious division, which is threatening to tear our country apart, then we will get, as David Betts and Dominic Cummings have warned, civil war. And it's entirely avoidable. I don't want thousands of people to be injured and dead. I don't want people storming the conspicuously new gates that have been put around the Palace of Westminster and the House of Lords recently. We all know why they're there. It's because they fear what will happen. It was only recently, it was late 2023, when the vote on a ceasefire in Parliament happened, and a giant mob gathered outside during the vote to pressure MPs to vote for it and broadcast from the river to the sea on the Elizabeth Tower, housing the bell of Big Ben, the big clock faces attached to Parliament. And Sir Lindsay Hoyle was petrified that MPs would be murdered, like Sir David Amess or Joe Cox were. If we don't change the settlement right now, if we don't stop telling ourselves these lies, that Britain is a nation of immigrants, that diversity is our strength, that assimilation is working, that we can all be run according to one big Michaela School, if we don't stop telling ourselves these lies, the predictable and preventable consequences of David Betts and Dominic Cummings' warnings of civil war will happen. And we don't want this. But we are what we continually do, and I don't listen to what a person says all the time. I listen to what they do. Their actions are what they truly believe. And so I can only infer that if the elite have been warned that this is the inevitable consequence, and they stick their heads in the sand like ostriches and ignore all this evidence anyway, that they either want this state of affairs, or they're at least not prepared to do what is necessary to prevent the state of affairs from coming to pass. And so they're just sleepwalking us into Lebanon or South Africa or Liberia. And this is why I've been hammering so hard on this point, is because my conscience plagues me to solve this problem, to participate in the solution to this problem, in any way that I can, before it's far too late. And the ICCC, this yet again non-independent state front that just gives jobs to people who have brought Britain to the brink of civil war without ever examining their priors, this just isn't good enough. And so I will be looking at its output, I will be reporting on this, and we can't let them get away with rewriting history in this fashion and using the Southport Riots and the imprisonment of people who expressed their outrage on social media, like Wayne O'Rourke, Judy Sweeney, Lucy Connolly, and the late Peter Lynch. We can't allow them to use this as yet more fodder for manufacturing consent to censor public discontent, engage in the downgrading of status of the white British in their own country, continue with mass immigration even though it has no democratic consent and never has, and continue to crowbar apart the settled British identities that comprise this land and made it great, to encompass its antagonistic antonyms, and say that even though the likes of Bob Villan, who are gloating that they've stolen this country from us and are open about hating us, to say that he is as indistinguishably British as you and me. It's just not true, and telling ourselves these lies will not solve the problem.